The Swarthmore Lecture is an annual lecture hosted by Woodbrook and was started in 1908. And it's a core part of the work of Woodbrook and an important aspect of the life of Quakers in Britain. The name Swarthmore was chosen in memory of the home of Margaret Fell. Her home was always open to the honest and earnest seeker after truth. I know that some joining us tonight are not Quakers and may not be familiar with Quaker worship or Quaker ministry, and only know us from history books or RE lessons. All are welcome. The Swarthmore Lecture continues to be an important part of Woodbrook's commitment to research, and it provides learning and inspiration long after the lecture itself. The lecture is given as prepared ministry, friends, and so there will be no questions at the end of the lecture, but there will be an opportunity to do so at 2 Meet the Swarthmore Lecturer Q&A sessions, one on Sunday evening, offered here at Friends House and online, and one on Wednesday, the 3rd of May, which is online only. Woodbrook will also be offering follow-up workshops with Esther in the summer, and details of these will be announced soon, and we'll also be working on a book to be published later this year. I'd now like to introduce our 2023 Swarthmore Lecturer, Esther Loukin. Esther is the co-founder of the disabled-led organisation Reasonable Access and is known for her activism, which challenges and works with organisations to hold them to account on disability access. Esther first connected with Quakers through Young Friends General Meeting and has deep affection for that community and its non-geographical nature. She's worshipped at several meetings over many years and is currently a member of Hartington Grove local meeting in Cambridge. Esther will speak from her experience of life as a disabled person and will reflect on how we can bring change in society, exploring the diversity of tactics we can use to achieve change. Esther will talk about what has enabled her work in relation to this and what work we all might do as a faith community and in our witness to further inclusion. The Swarthmore Lecture is offered as ministry, and we ask if you would receive it in that spirit. We will not applaud at the end. Instead, when Esther has finished, we'll sit together and reflect in stillness for a few moments, and Esther and I will then shake hands, which will indicate the end of the lecture. Let us now settle into the stillness, and Esther will begin when she is ready.
This lecture is about access, inclusion, equality, with a focus on disability. It's an invitation to join me in spotting patterns which are underneath those here and now details of the measurable end results of inequality, the patterns which are within all of us and between all of us, and which sometimes keep inequality going. My invitation is to think about what enables people to be and bring their best, and what makes that really hard. both within our society, the Religious Society of Friends, and within wider society. I bring my professional expertise in helping groups and businesses not to exclude disabled people, including my nerdy love of all things which can be measured. But more than that, I bring my own professional and unmeasurable life experience of so much of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start by explaining why I'm down here on the floor rather than up there on the platform. I invite you to listen, not for the top level things, although they might be interesting, but for what's underneath, both for me and for us together. I was asked to share from my activism of suing people. I've generally not felt I had much choice about taking action in various forms. I'm lucky that I feel driven to do it and that I have at least some capacity to do so. Suing people is not traditional activism. I'm going to share some of how I've used the law, but more importantly, why I used the law, rather than other approaches. And I'm going to share some of my personal reflections about this work, particularly some things that COVID really taught me. My proposal is, to quote Mia Mingus, that access is love, and that love requires access of us. When I talk about inclusion, I mean the physical environment, but more than that, I mean the social and emotional space that we share together. Some of my enthusiasm and hope is for the obvious reason. I like to live my own life. But it's more than that. I really believe in better spaces and structures that enable everyone to thrive. Done well, inclusion shrinks into the background so we don't notice it. Sometimes it brings us moments of joy where we're aware of being upheld by the objects and people around us. Thinking physically, all of us will at various points have luggage, be tired, be looking after children, get an injury, or get older. We'll also be sad. Many of us will have a mental health condition. We might have dementia or another type of neurodivergence. Inclusion welcomes us all in whatever state we're in, so that our state isn't the main thing we notice. Our bodies and minds will change over time. I believe that we should create more spaces and ways of being which not only tolerate or accept this, but celebrate and cultivate all of these different things. I'm going to share some of where I feel deeply seen in Quaker writings, particularly Quaker faith and practice, and where I find parts of my experience missing or just outright incompatible. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that make this work I've been doing hard, sometimes impossible. I'm going to share some of the things that need to be in place for me to do anything that could be considered even slightly society changing. I hope that this might help us think about what we can do to enable everyone among us to thrive and continue thriving. So, I'm speaking from the floor for two reasons. I'm explaining it for two reasons. Firstly, to address the metaphorical elephant in the room. I really don't want what is a minor access decision to end up distracting. And I hope that explaining can acknowledge it and allow us to move on together. The second reason for explaining why I'm on the floor is that I think it might offer some helpful examples of the wider points that I'm going to go on to. In that sense, I hope the explanation is helpful. Not as some particular focal point, but as an example which we can use to help us think of other examples of the same pattern. the way onto our stage is by platform lift. If you didn't know, it's hidden in the stairs, kind of behind and over that way. I understand some of why it's a platform lift. This room, the light, will be considered one of the many exceptional circumstances where building inspectors find a platform lift acceptable. But, like many disabled people, I can't operate a platform lift myself. They are slow and notoriously unreliable, particularly for powered wheelchair users. We swap stories of the source of our hatred for them and of being stuck in them. I've never noticed anyone using our magic stairs lift for convenience, which is often a mark of really high quality inclusive design. No one just takes the lift, that lift, because they're tired or they injured their ankle or they've got a large stack of papers to carry. There's nothing wonderful about a platform lift. They're a least bad option at the very best. When I began to think about the practicalities of doing this lecture, I first thought of this like it was a presentation at work or in a campaigning context. I would use the lift while trying not to share both my fear and frustration. I would, as I often have, drink less. I'd arrive with a mild dehydration headache and extremely early. Best case, I'd get onto the stage and have about half an hour to read a calming book and meditate a little before people even began coming into this room. If I wanted to get off the stage for any reason, I wouldn't be able to, probably for a few hours. And if there was an emergency, everyone else would go first. Sure, I thought, I can prepare some words about the work I've done about accessibility, disability rights and inclusion and deliver them from the stage. In my initial mind's eye, I'd have left enough extra time to get stuck on the lift, and for several slightly stressed people responsible for logistical arrangements to flap around me doing various things to get it to work. I would have directed them in a familiar patter of things to try when a platform lift has failed, and they would have been surprised at my extensive lift-fixing knowledge. And probably would eventually have got it working. I'd then have had just a few minutes to gather myself, and then I'd deliver this, leaning on the fact that it was pre-prepared, so my raised adrenaline probably wouldn't impact it a whole lot, and not too many people would be any the wiser. In my initial thoughts, I'd have also pre-prepared for the scenario of delivering from the lift. Stuck, neither up nor down. Facing these people over here. And I'd have pre-prepared for a last-minute change to delivering from the floor, as when a lift is really on the blink, gravity means getting down is always easier than up. If that happened last minute, I'd be surrounded by slightly disappointed people who had just panic moved a lot of chairs and Quakers. I'd have at least one, probably more, slightly dark, but not entirely inappropriate jokes to take the edge off this discomfort. Probably, I'd offer anecdotes from my extensive expertise of being stuck in Quaker lifts. This might be their first time, but it's not mine. I'd have prepared like this because that's the way to ensure that if this happens, which it very much might, I don't end up sobbing in public, feeling fragile all weekend, and with that being my abiding memory of yearly meeting. Of course, past me thought, I must use the lift. Having the fancy lift is a nod to my welcome. It would be ungrateful, a bit rude not to use it, really awkward for me and for everyone else. If I didn't use the lift, I might make people feel inclusion was difficult or unachievable. People would ask me questions about what we should have done instead of installing this lift, and told me stories about how previously there wasn't a lift. Of course, I thought, I should acknowledge their efforts and progress. If I didn't use the lift, I also might make it awkward for future wheelchair users, whether they made the same decision or not for whatever reason. It felt really familiar to plan like this, for the possibility, but not the likelihood, that everything would go smoothly. For a few known unknowns, scenarios which, from my experience, were quite possible, but where it was hard to know which one would occur. For it to be probable that something would go wrong, but not to know what, and for the smaller possibility of something really quite disastrous, but where I still wanted and needed to deliver. For my message to be far from my mind, subsumed by the practicalities which are not of my choosing and which are boring and which intrude on so many parts of my life. And for a cascade of strangely intense reactions from others, which don't ease the clash between the way I am and what I need and the real world as it really is. When I first sat considering whether to accept this amazing invitation, I felt really uncomfortable, both at the idea of using the lift and at the idea of not using the lift. I still do. I have no idea what my discernment would have looked like, felt like, if this hadn't intruded really heavily at the beginning. This isn't a presentation at work, where my practice planning is almost always a good approach. Sharing ministry while that cut off from myself is perhaps impossible and certainly a disservice to me and to those of you spending your time listening. And I think that's what I felt uncomfortable about. What I would have brought would have been much reduced by that. In some ways, I would still prefer be up there on the stage, discomforted in different but much more familiar ways than this. Instead, I'm choosing to sit here on the floor because the way onto the stage is a platform lift. Of course, I'm not the first person thinking and writing about disability or disability and access within Britain Yearly Meeting. At number 2338 in our current Quaker Faith and Practice is Carol Gardner's writing about her realisation that she did not have enough reserves of spiritual and physical energy at that time to go to a residential yearly meeting, and so it was not accessible to her. She said that we should ask ourselves continually if this consideration towards disabled people is being maintained and whether it goes far enough. If we mean that there's that of God in everyone, then it behoves us to look with creative, loving imagination at the condition of every human being. This includes listening to what they say and the words they choose to say it, and also listening for what they do not or cannot say. It does not mean listening to what someone else says supposedly on their behalf. Creative, loving imagination. How wonderful. Yes, please. Much of my work on accessibility and inclusion has been premised on the idea, the seeming fact, that change is hard and slow. And for sure, it usually is. But COVID made me know in my bones that we can do things which are bold. Zoom existed for a long time before 2020, and so did telephones, cameras, and staff. Yet, as far as I know, we never considered a remote attendance option before the pandemic. I had certainly never considered asking for it for yearly meeting or any other thing that I couldn't attend. It would have felt utopian, unrealistic. I don't think I would even have considered it to dismiss the idea. My dreams simply did not stretch that far. Even, perhaps because there have been yearly meetings that I've been unable to take part in because of my disability. Yet, last year, At our first hybrid yearly meeting, a friend ministered about how she had never expected to be able to attend yearly meeting ever again due to age. And yet this pandemic-inspired change had allowed it for her. She isn't the only one who, for reasons of age, illness, disability, climate, money, time, or some combination, find getting to friends' house for several days of intense Quakering very difficult or impossible. Probably remote access wasn't possible in 1989 when Gardner wrote, but it was possible before 2020, had we thought of it, wanted to. All sorts of groups of disabled people were disproportionately negatively impacted by COVID, and still are, and that's really well documented. I want to share a different aspect of my very personal experience, though. Something wonderful, light, life-giving. My home is far from perfect, but it is more accessible to me than anywhere else in the rest of the world. The lockdown novelty of being able to treat my body well has not worn off for me. I'm still spending much more time at home than I did pre-2020, and I intend to maintain that. When I'm working from home, I cherish the fact that I can move around and spend time in positions that my body needs and desires, but which are hard or impossible in public. And I can get on with my day rather than just managing the discomfort in other ways. The pacing that so many health professionals have told me to use over the years became much more feasible. At home, I drink when I'm thirsty, and I go to the toilet when I want, and I do various things like physical exercise, which my home enables and can nearly never happen when I'm not there. Pre-pandemic, I had built myself a wonderful life, which was so hostile to the most basic things that my body needs. And to be constantly rubbing away at myself like sandpaper diminished the wonder I could find in the moment, and also compromised my contribution towards things I was doing. I can literally think more clearly when most of my bodily needs are met, not only the few that I've assessed as sufficiently critical and which the environment sort of maybe allows. Over time, treating my body well, some unpleasant things which I and my doctors had accepted as just an inevitable part of my existing receded. Giving my physical body what it needed means it is more able to serve me going forwards. Doing things in person is wonderful, of course, but so is doing things remotely. This weekend, I've already attended sessions remotely from my hotel room, as well as ones in person, and I shall continue to do a mix. I hope that I can cultivate more creative, loving imagination in the future. I want to wonder whether there are other things that might help us to be together, which I haven't thought of, like I hadn't thought of Zoom. I want to propose things that really would help me and to work at them for others, even and perhaps especially when they're hard or feel strange. I hope creative, loving imagination can enable us to move on when things haven't worked well and to try something different again and again and again. For me, one small step, particularly in a narrow doorway, might as well be a flight of stairs. I'm not the only one. Best practice for new designs recommends no more than 5mm, which is just half a centimetre, of uplift for accessibility. Uplift is a step or a lip to you or I, and it can be a really big problem. I can glance at a street and eyeball which uplifts will be okay and which ones won't. And this isn't always a static thing. There are paving stones, which are effectively steps. I go round them or even into the road to avoid them. If it's raining, particularly if it's a smooth tiled floor, it will be slippy, and there needs to be more room to slide about if a doorway isn't completely flat. There is a street near to where I live that is known for being friendly, local, welcoming, and full of small independent shops selling novel legumes, lovely fresh produce, and second-hand things. I suspect you can all think of the place near you with a similar vibe. You might bump into Quakers there. The individuals were nice, sometimes even apologetic. But despite over a decade of my asking politely, they'd failed to do even the very minimum of buying a portable ramp between a few shops for less than 50 quid for the single steps to get in. I wanted to be welcome. This felt really stinging to me, and I resented every time I ended up in the enormous, boring shopping centre with its smooth, perfect floors and its total lack of any personality. I knew that the Equality Act 2010 was supposed to protect me in this situation. That act followed the more well-known Disability Discrimination Act, which came in '95. So that's 28 years ago now. The parts of the Act, that's the Equality Act 2010, that I've focused on is the need for reasonable adjustments. Steps are a really basic example. A flight of steps for all isn't equality. Some people can't use them, while others can. Wheelchair users particularly need an alternative. The Act rejects a charity model to disability and proposes that we don't need pity, we need rights. It requires that if there's something which excludes a group of disabled people, something reasonable should be done about it. It also says, and I think this truth is my very favourite part of the Equality Act 2010, that a failure to make reasonable adjustments is discrimination. Steps without an alternative are usually a relatively simple breach. They can be measured and photographed. Both my relative privilege and my love of rules and procedures meant that I thought it would be relatively simple to get the difficulties acknowledged. So, I made the very dubious decision in hindsight to use the law to fix the street. I felt I could do nothing else. Was that initial decision a leading? I still don't know. I think it probably was. It's led me to some very interesting places since. The Equality Act 2010 can only be enforced by people who experience the discrimination. I can take cases about steps which impact me, but not, for example, about a lack of large print information which doesn't impact me as I have 20/20 vision with glasses. Writing to your MP or local councillor cannot help with this. Disabled people asking nicely for decades has not helped. There isn't any external enforcement. No agency goes to check, like with food safety or minimum wage breaches. There isn't a hotline that I can pass over flagrant breaches to someone else to deal with. The police have no role in this whatsoever. If not me, who? When I challenged those shops, I was making a point about the little indignities of life as a wheelchair user. When an adjustment can enable me to go into somewhere, particularly when it's a cheap and easy adjustment, and they've chosen not to make that adjustment, I'm excluded. And when this happens again and again and again, it sands away at my sense of being a full citizen. The steps are symbolic. They say, in repetitive and small ways, you are not a person we consider a customer. You are not a member of the public. You are not a member of the community. You're separate and different. They also squash spontaneity and choice and joy. I end up going to the same places, eating the same things, life shrinking, or always having to do far more planning than others. So, I wrote letters instigating a civil legal case to all the premises with steps and no ramp. And then I followed through. I issued the forms with the court. I attended hearings in front of judges, and I prepared seemingly endless reams of documents. The whole affair took several years and had lots of twists and turns. Loads of new ramps appeared. Not just the shops I'd challenged, but all over the city and further afield. And now, when I or other people raise an access issue, it's likely to be fixed quite quickly. Other wheelchair users still intermittently thank me for it. The impact was much wider than just those cases. While steps are the most simple example, they're not the biggest disability equality issue, just the easiest and most obvious, and one that impacts me. I have said, including in public, that I'd never take a case about a reprehensible toilet, because being cross-examined on precisely what the impact of that is would be too humiliating. Entirely surprising myself, I think I was wrong. I suspect soon I will take one of those cases, and that the skills and support that I've acquired since then will mean that I can do it without excessive distress. It's not glamorous, but it's important, and it's a real constraint. I still think I won't ever take a case about a situation where I'm discriminated against because of the way my brain works, the things I'm good at and the things I find nearly impossible. Too hard to explain, too hard to pick apart, too distressing to be challenged on and pathologized about in public. Perhaps I'll end up wrong about that too. There is that old saying, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. One of the things that this work has led me to reflect on is where law is helpful, maybe even the best tool, and where it's the wrong tool. Law is my favourite tool, for sure, but no one should have one tool, and I have lots of others. And even this one tool has many ways of being used. I hope this lecture will spark conversations about which tools you all have in your own toolboxes. Are they spiritual tools or social change tools? Are some tools both? For me, they are usually different, but one supports the other. All tactics and tools are inherently flawed and imperfect. I do think the law should be used by more disabled people because, as I explained, there's very little other enforcement at the moment and because it's really effective at creating change. While there are thousands of instances of discrimination that impact me, little and large, I cannot and should not sue them all. So, the trick is in working out where to focus. There are other reasons for me to use this method. I really love law. There's something about the way that it tries to turn the vast complexity of human experience into discrete, organised parts that really suits the way I think. I enjoy learning about it, and I've got better at it. To stop now would be a fine decision, but to continue allows me to build on what I've learned and get better at some of it. Another reason is my personal capacity. I hate a lot of meetings. Our business meetings usually are an exception, but even those I have limited capacity for. Meetings don't generally get the best out of me, and they are costly. Marches and vigils also sap every bit of every type of energy I have. I will do them once in a while when they're the tactic that is really required, but they are not generally pleasant for me. I need a lot of time on my own to recover from that kind of activism. Conversely, working alone on a computer, any time of day or night, as and when I'm able, plays to the strengths of my body and my brain. And it is this combination, working to my strengths and actually achieving something, that is the sweet spot. I still sometimes pursue issues about steps and ramps. I wish that wasn't still a live problem in my life, but it is. I've challenged the government on the way that these cases can entail financial risk for disabled people, which mean that the law is hard to enforce and therefore minimally useful. I've challenged the courts themselves on their failures to make reasonable adjustments, which means that justice is particularly difficult for disabled people to achieve. I helped UK athletics to realise that its no wheels rule was discriminatory, and as a result of that rule changing, I took part in my first para-half marathon in January this year. I challenged a holiday company for incorrect access information about a hotel. National Express coaches have agreed with me that they need to update their wheelchair spaces on their coaches, and they have a programme to do so. From the middle of next year, wheelchair users will, like everyone else, be able to travel on all National Express coaches. The police agreed with me that they discriminated against me when I had a car crash. And we're discussing how they can fix the problem for the future. And I'm working on ambulance service discrimination too at the moment. There's others done and still very much not done yet. Often my feelings about a particular injustice act as a sort of motor, propelling me on even when it's really hard. Emotions can be distracting, directing my attention to something which is personal to me and not very relevant in a wider sense. But sometimes my strength of feeling has encouraged me to follow up on things where the wider impact wasn't clear yet. I often wonder if that's the spirit, and I think it often is. All cases are different. Some of them remain adversarial throughout. Some of them shift and become a more productive shared approach to fixing what went wrong. I love those ones the most. So, that brings me on to a related point. Requiring people who've been discriminated against to be the people who take action on that, and there being no other mechanism, means that the law increases, not decreases, the disadvantage it's supposed to reduce. Often, the process of showing the detriment is detrimental. Sufficiently so that most disabled people decide never to do so. I do choose to do some of it, but I wish I didn't need to. I generally limit my complaints to discrimination which is truly unacceptable, but which is relatively low level, as the distress of explaining that is less than repeating the distress of the things which have the biggest impact on me. When I take a case about something which is a bigger deal, like the police discrimination I experienced when I had a car crash, or the hospital discrimination I faced when I had an operation, I must accept that the negative impact on me of the initial problem will be multiplied many times over by challenging that injustice. I weigh new cases and decision points in existing cases in two main places: meeting for worship and exercise. In both of these, I find the decision will often become clear or clearer, and not always in the way that I expect. I also find peace there, here, in stopping pursuing something, at least for now. I am just one woman, and this is not the only thing that I am doing with my one life. I went looking for some Quaker thought about this, but searching Quaker faith and practice for a perspective on disability, there's not a whole lot. There's nothing specific on disability equality or rights or justice. There's a fairly throwaway remark that trustees should comply with discrimination law, and that when considering building a new meeting house, people with disabilities, enabling easy access for people with disabilities should be a criteria for that building. There is a comment that special attention might need to be paid to people who take little part in a meeting because of disability. The other reasons for special attention are youth, age, and disaffection. There are 3 pieces by people noted as disabled people. The one from Carol Gardner that I already mentioned, a piece by Bernard Brett, and Jonathan Griffith's deep, in places harrowing, testimony of him experiencing discrimination more than 40 years ago. There's also other passages about serious illness, which are under an umbrella of disability, but don't use that word. And Advices and Queries 29. Advices and Queries 29. My want is to skip past it, try to pretend it isn't there. I find myself wanting to temper what I'm about to say, to share my very favourite advices and queries and how that's changed over time, and how overall Advices and Queries is one of my favourite pieces of writing. But I must spend some time on this. It's important. Its familiar text reads like this. Approach old age with courage and hope. As far as possible, make arrangements for your care in good time so that an undue burden does not fall on others. Although old age may bring increasing disability and loneliness, it can also bring serenity, detachment, and wisdom. Pray that in your final years you may be enabled to find new ways of receiving and reflecting God's love. Let's start with the bookends of number 29. I don't have any deep difficulty with them. The beginning advises us to approach old age with courage and hope, and the end offers, pray that in your final years you may be enabled to find new ways of receiving and reflecting God's love. I would like to approach all parts of life with courage and hope, and at all times seek and find new ways of receiving and reflecting God's love. I frequently fail, but these are reminders for all of life. Perhaps there is something here about getting older that I'm missing, given that I am not, in fact, particularly old. But I don't think there is, friends. The middle sentence talks about the terrible things, disability and loneliness. Although old age may bring increasing disability and loneliness, it can also bring serenity, detachment, and wisdom. I'm unclear if they're written like this as they're linked to each other, or whether each one is separately linked to old age. They can somehow be mitigated with serenity, detachment, and wisdom. But friends, I can assure you that for me, disability is not even slightly linked with serenity. There are echoes here of something that resonates with me, that a body and/or a mind which doesn't quite do what I want, which is difficult and unpredictable, can bring spiritual growth. There are skills and understandings which I have, and I'm glad to have, which come from some really hard experiences, as well as from some joyful ones. But there are also threads here that I reject. The sentence which I reread again and again and again, trying to find the truth within it, and thus far finding very little, is make arrangements for your care in good time so that an undue burden does not fall on others. What is an undue burden? The undue seems to be trying to acknowledge that caring about and caring for others may sometimes be too much. But I'm not sure it's possible to make arrangements which ensure that any burden is not undue, because whether or not that is so depends at least as much on the person who is caring for or caring about. It reminds me of the reasonable in reasonable adjustments. It suggests that you should minimize your needs and their impact on others. Suck it up if at all you can. There's another aspect that troubles me. Make arrangements. This sounds like tidying up and organizing. It is wise to think about what you want in the future, of course, but disability and aging can't be put in a box or subcontracted. Care of, care about, cannot be arranged except in extremely broad terms. More to the point, I'm not sure it's particularly desirable to try. Humanity is interdependent, however much some of us might sometimes prefer that this wasn't so. Most of us give and receive care of the same or different types throughout our lives. And if someone is experiencing their responsibilities to the people close to them as requiring more than they can give, the solution isn't somehow to remove the person or their needs. Perhaps the advice is financially focused. The issue there is that there's no amount of money that can guarantee that disability or ageing will be smooth. And if someone's support costs more than they have, the issue is unlikely to be a deficit of prudence. The advice to avoid being an undue burden is qualified with as far as possible. But given that I was unable to plan for my care before I was born, and nor could I ever earn enough to cover the cost of it, I don't find that particularly comforting. Am I an undue burden on others? What is an undue burden? Who am I an undue burden on? What is it about old age and about disability which apparently means one may be a burden? Is the potential burden just financial or my presence? Would it be better if I wasn't causing a burden? And if so, how can I make that happen? This advice feels burdensome. I find myself thinking about how without excellent care, healthcare, sure, but much more than that, the social care that I have, which undoubtedly many people do think makes me a burden, I would simply not be here. Both in big ways, I might well be dead, but in thousands of smaller ways too. I wouldn't have got dressed this afternoon. My wheelchair wouldn't be charged. I wouldn't sit in the mornings enjoying the birds in the trees in my garden. My warm socks wouldn't be clean and in the drawer I like them in. I certainly wouldn't have written any part of this lecture. I wouldn't have gone to help my friend when she was having a mental health crisis, or help my other friend to organise her own care plan, or given someone a lift a couple of days ago. I'd never have done any Quaker roles at all, local or central, or any other roles that aren't Quaker. I wouldn't have swum in the river recently, or put up a shelf, or attended 3 hospital appointments last week, 2 for me and 1 for the dog. These are a fairly random selection. They're not a complete list, or a special list of incredible things. They're the normal bits of life. I'm in my 30s, so you can say that I'm not the primary focus of this advice. Maybe, but I'm not so sure. It seems to me to be quite clearly about our thoughts on care, particularly social care, and on finance, as well as disability and ageing. As the world began to open up after the COVID lockdown, it became more common, at least when meeting so-called vulnerable people, to discuss details like whether you were going to meet inside or outside, whether people would be wearing masks, how much distance you wanted to keep. For me, these conversations felt very familiar. They echo conversations that I have all the time about lifts and steps and toilets and timing and all sorts of other things. These are conversations about access, about how everyone's needs can or cannot be met. We had learnt to live with a level of unpredictability which was already familiar to some of us, but less familiar to others. Anything might well be cancelled. There might need to be a plan B or C or D. Changes in plans didn't just happen because you or the person you're seeing has COVID. It might be that COVID had interrupted childcare, a venue, transport, a supply chain, or something else. Some parts of my normal felt much more shared. In disability spaces, in disability culture, meeting people's accessibility needs is a prioritised practice. It's hard, but that's the point. Like our testimonies, it's an active practice, not a statement. Some people in the rest of the world are very keen to get beyond these conversations about access, to not have them anymore. I often find the spirit in these conversations, and I really enjoyed the brief interlude where most people were dipping their toe into messy, imperfect access. Dealing with not having my own access needs met, at least at the initial time it happens, rarely has much spiritual practice in it for me. It distracts at best, and at worst, it upsets and enrages me. Meeting other people's access needs nearly always does feel like a spiritual practice for me. I find groups, Quaker or not, who don't want to have these meta conversations about what is working or not very difficult. How can we work together if we're unable to say what's working or not for us, even and especially when other people have different, even contradictory or incompatible experiences? Of course, we don't want that to be all or even most of what we do, but if it's none, we guarantee that some people are excluded. Accessibility is never only a disability thing. Different people with the same disability may have completely different ways that that need is best met. Some approaches work well for some situations and not for others. There will always be new situations to puzzle out. The legal cases that I took and continue to take are about expecting people to do the very minimum, reasonable adjustments, and about what the minimum is, what's reasonable. For us, as a Quaker community, I think there are some more helpful guiding principles than compliance with the law. The hashtag #AccessIsLove was part of a project by Mia Mingus, Alice Wong and Sandy Ho. In the keynote speech of its launch event, they said this: "Access for the sake of access or inclusion is not necessarily liberatory, but access done in the service of love, justice, connection, and community is liberatory and has the power to transform." I love this framing. Access is love. What does love require of us? I've come to see talking about and acknowledging my own access needs as part of my witness to truth. It's easier to minimise them, sweep them under the carpet. I think my desire to have the very basics is quite understandable, and when I've achieved that, I usually want to stop talking about it. There are a lot of other things I'm interested in and care about, but to end my expectations at the critical is a disservice to me and to others. I don't want to scrape by. I want ease, welcome, love for all of us. I find my experience missing from Quaker talk about simplicity. Much of my life is astonishingly complex, with little choice on my part. It is not simple. To limit it further would not spiritually enrich me. I love the aspiration of being able to focus on the spiritual, but it's not my reality. The route around this building is so confusing, I'm repeatedly going back to the instructions. I don't notice what is or is not simple on the walls. I notice more the kind staff trying to intercept me and funnel me in the one right direction. I love buildings or bits of buildings where I go with the flow of the people like everyone else. I think the sort of simplicity I would strive for is to leave the house with the same planning as other people. I aspire to pop to the park with the dog and delight in the interesting surfaces I feel beneath me without discovering a road I can't get across. Meanwhile, I hoard items which somewhat mitigate the inaccessible world we live in. If you need to borrow a beach wheelchair, or you want some weird ramps to get into a suburban house, or your wheelchair armrest is broken, my garage may well be what you need. I'm generous with who I share my treasure trove with, but getting rid of it would seem reckless. Simplicity isn't just about individual choice, it is constrained. Another example, when plastic disposable drinking straws were banned, drinking when out and about became something of an adventurous activity for me. I can drink some drinks in some cups some of the time without a straw, but sometimes end up pouring it all over myself or other people. And there are few drinks where I can drink the bottom half of the cup. None, and I do mean none, of the alternatives do the job for nearly everyone in the way that plastic straws do. I've been carrying silicone straws since long before it was the done thing, when I had to import them myself from America. They work really well for me, but nowhere in public will clean them, so that limits what sort of drinks can be had on a day out. And for some people, silicone straws aren't safe, so replacement with silicone alone wouldn't work. Nowhere, our cafe included, has reusable straws, or the awkward little brushes to wash them with. So I must now remember not just the straws, but a bag for manky used ones. And I must never be unexpectedly delayed somewhere and have more drinks than I planned when I left the house, which usually I achieve with support. But sometimes I, and whoever is supporting me, forgets, or I'm delayed, often by something like being stuck in a lift. Before the ban, I could get a disposable one. Now, not being able to have an extra cup of tea on a late train feels like a harsh consequence, and I am not convinced it's of much assistance to the climate crisis. I note that disposable cups are still allowed. This is an improvement which has a disproportionate impact on disabled people while not really addressing a real issue. In a way that is very familiar, it shows a pattern. Just one small, extra burdensome thing for me to do. Over my life, I've used many different types of what we call social care. I'm lucky because, as Frances Ryan points out in her book Crippled, there are over 1 million people without the social care that they need, which is equivalent to the population of Birmingham being unable to get dressed in the morning or being housebound. Having help with daily things in life is not, on its own, a negative thing. Different to most people's experiences, sure, but also wonderful. The process of getting that help, though, is much harder than access difficulties like steps and toilets. It is truly burdensome. Not infrequently, it hijacks my life for often quite long periods of time. While sometimes I can find God somewhere in that horror, more often I can find little more than just keeping on, keeping on. Then it will settle down and life will be glorious for a time, until the next email or letter starting the next process. I am supported by wonderful people who enable me to do the things I want to do. But the faff to get to that hangs over my head. This year's antics of the state have been so dramatic that I don't even know where to begin to try and explain. So I'm not going to. I'm just going to speak the truth, that I've had little chance to prepare this, and that it was and is really and truly completely out of my control. The problem was caused by a mistake someone made, a mistake where my life and the things that I want to do and which are important to me are just the casual collateral. At any time, I'm usually being assessed by multiple different bits of the government at once to see if my lifelong disability is lifelong. These aren't to see if things need tweaking to maximise my life, but come from an enthusiasm to reduce my support, as if I must be punished if I'm doing too well. Hilary Cottam describes this as if being in a game of pass the parcel, assessed, referred and assessed again, a system where 80% of the resource available must be spent on gatekeeping, on managing the queue, on referring individuals from service to service, on recording every interaction to ensure that no one is responsible for those who absolutely will fall through the gaps. Then, there are small added extras, like this week's national shortage of a medical supply without which I couldn't leave the house, and which took several full days of this week to sort before I could get here. Let me give you another example of these processes. It's just one and it's incomplete. None of the individuals involved are at fault. It's a systems problem, or maybe by design. I use a scheme called Access to Work, which provides support for disabled people to do paid work. This year, my wheelchair is due to be replaced due to old age, so I've applied to Access to Work to support my new wheelchair, ideally before this one gives up the ghost completely. I'm lucky to be able to do some work, and being able to apply to Access to Work is a choice. And other people cannot get such great mobility equipment, but this is quite the process. Before my claim could be considered, I first needed to have an assessment by NHS Wheelchair Services to establish that they can't meet my in-work mobility needs, even though we all know they cannot. The wait for the assessment took around a year from referral. I needed to research the market and get a quote for a suitable chair, including some bespoke components, and show how each one relates to my work specifically. Then, I needed to get some comparative quotes, or alternatively proof that a single supplier is the only option. Then, I can apply to vary my Access to Work by adding a wheelchair to this year's award. Twice, I was wrongly told that I was ineligible and had to appeal. One of those, I had to get legal advice to know how to appeal. Both were categorised as mistakes. Understandable, except that I've never made an application to Access to Work which didn't have mistakes. About 8 months later, I was confirmed eligible. If I was employed, I would need to establish whether and how much my employer would pay. I'm self-employed, so that part was mercifully brief. Access to Work determines that I need to make a personal contribution to account for using the wheelchair at the weekend and the days I don't work, which is around half the £25,000 price tag. I can apply to Motability to assist with the personal contribution part. Another process. I must pay for the wheelchair, and then Motability will refund their portion. Access to Work also pays on a reclaim basis, but they may take up to 9 months to pay, and if they lose the forms less than twice, I consider I've done quite well. If I fill in another form, they might be able to pay in advance, rather than me being refunded, but only if I can find a supplier happy with their terms, including the absurd 9-month wait, which most suppliers are not. Only once all of this has been done can I contact a different section of Motability who will begin considering whether my car, which I drive from my wheelchair, needs some adjustments to safely drive from the new wheelchair, and that will take some more months. And if from start to finish this takes less than 2.5 years, I will be delighted with myself. None of this is work, it's what I must do in order to work, and it's repeated across multiple areas of my life. And it's the example that I have picked because it is the least upsetting. Being disabled is extremely expensive. After disability benefits, which are designed to account for the extra costs of disability, last year a UK household with a disabled person in it needed an average of £975 a month to achieve the same, an extra £975 a month to achieve the same standard of living as households without a disabled person in. This year, that's over £13,000 a year. That's in addition to the state benefits designed to reduce the extra costs. For half of those disabled people, the cost is more, and it's higher still if there are 2 or more disabled people in the household. There's a chronic shortage of accessible homes for disabled people, and if you're lucky enough to have a suitable home, that will, at the very least, limit your ability to move for love or work or anything else. It means that we often live long-term in homes which are only partially suitable, accepting a lot that others wouldn't. It's draining on your body for daily activities to be harder than is necessary, and it's draining on your mind and your soul too. for your home to not be welcoming and not facilitate the things you want to do. And we're always aware that we're the lucky ones. Often we've spent time in accommodation even more unsuitable, and we're loath to complain. One of my very good friends, also a Quaker, is watching this from her care home room. She'd like to be here, as she has been at other yearly meetings, but it's impossible this time. She had a change in her disability about 18 months ago, and after a spell in hospital, and despite many people's efforts, has still not been able to get her care sorted so she can move home. She's an NHS psychologist for people with learning disabilities. She is working all the parts of her job which can be done remotely from a care home room, because a different part of the NHS hasn't managed to organise the care so that she can go home. My friend can't leave the care home. She's effectively incarcerated while she waits. Waiting is, I think, one of the defining features of disabled life. It is not the gentle, hopeful waiting of a settled meeting for worship, but a despairing limbo while you watch your life drift by with very limited ability to be an architect in your own future. People whose support needs are because of a learning disability or autism have an even more grim time. Many of you will have seen the news this week that yet another scandal, Wharton Hall, has resulted in criminal convictions of staff for abusing patients. But these things happen, and they happen again and again and again, because there aren't good systems for people to have support at home, support which is often cheaper and which is always more humane. Even in the so-called community, there are major problems. And I agree with the academic Lucy Series when she says that for abolitionist and reform projects alike, we need a clearer sense of what we mean by liberty for these populations and what a positive outcome looks like. The systems currently promote bad practice, even abuse, and they do not promote thriving for either the people paid to work in them or those of us who the industry is built around. I tried to find a single person in my extended social network who uses social care and has not experienced abuse within it. Friends, I could not find one. The state says quite explicitly that those of us needing help from it are being unreasonable, wanting too much. This isn't just my imagination. Bryony Shannon, who blogs about words and care, observes that the people deciding on resource allocation use the divisive language of the battlefield: frontline, duty, officer, hero. In service land, the only thing valid is need, and a very narrow definition of what need is. And the reminders that I am expensive, too expensive, are constant. I should not want anything. Wanting, let alone dreaming, is a sin in this space. I'm unreasonable, taking from others, burdening the taxpayer, unrealistic. I have very few entitlements. I'm petitioning power to grant me humanity, and sometimes they partially do, temporarily. And when the state finally does concede that support is necessary, it will argue between itself, through me, about which part ought to do the supporting. It's necessary for me to engage with, but it's very burdensome. It doesn't need to be like this. As the C of E Archbishop recently wrote, care and support should enable us to live the best lives we can. It's about human flourishing, or, in the language of the Bible, life in all its fullness. That's John 10:10. And he went on to offer a hopeful alternative. I was surprised. Our vision derives from our shared humanity rather than consumerism and rests on bonds of love, mutuality, and interdependence. It regards good care as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. That end is living a good and equal life in an accessible environment, free from discrimination, with support to participate in education, work, family life, leisure, community, and worship for as long as possible. Relationships are vital to the realisation of this visit. I think I can pretty confidently say that we prefer that vision of human flourishing. That doesn't necessarily ease the burden on those of us experiencing it, though. Those of us who need to deal with these powerful structures, making decisions that impact our lives or lives of people close to us, often don't share, except with each other. Of course, we should all be able to keep private what we want to, but this is a silence often wrapped up in shame that can amplify the harm that is being done to us, and it's often not for our benefit that we stay quiet. When I made that first series of complaints, I was hijacked by my own emotions when I received personal attacks and criticism. I doubted my truth, and sometimes I backed down when I shouldn't have. Sometimes I became wrapped up in details that were nearly irrelevant, legally for sure and morally also. It's not possible to have much distance or objectivity about harm which you've personally experienced. People in power, on behalf of the shopkeepers, implored me to engage in debate and be reasonable. And I felt that if I didn't spend as much time as they chose engaging, then I had less legitimacy. If I'd had a lawyer, that would have helped a lot, but for various reasons, these kind of cases are usually impossible to get lawyers for. Anyway, no amount of engagement would have been useful or sufficient for them because their aim wasn't engagement. The role of those people in that particular pattern was to distract and to protect the status quo of exclusion. Other disabled people have helped me to pattern spot in the responses we get and to spot patterns in my responses too. There are two main categories of responses from people who've received a complaint about discrimination. Litigation pulls out particularly intense versions, but they're the same pattern as happen when trying to improve things informally. The first I'll call, "You are the problem." And the second, "I am actually excellent." Both "you are the problem" and "I am actually excellent" have the quality of being dismissive, and neither seeks to fix the problem. They serve to try and make me go away, and sometimes they succeed. They're not entirely untrue reactions either, even when they're not valid legal defences. For example, it undoubtedly is the case that people running businesses often don't know that they're breaching equality legislation in relation to disabled people or otherwise. Listed building status really can be a barrier to physical access, though it's also a really popular excuse to preserve exclusion into the future. I am not always the most amiable of complainers, particularly if I'm tired, hungry, or shocked. But the right way to respond to someone drawing a problem to your attention is never "you are actually the problem" or "I am actually excellent." I also notice similar categories of resistance within myself. Sometimes, when I've learned that I've not met someone else's needs fully, I find myself thinking, "Well, I did this other thing," or "Oh, this is distracting me from what I'm doing," or even, "I can never succeed at this." These are very understandable feelings, and noticing them both helps me to take a break and then try again, but also to always keep the humanity of people who are harming me in my mind when I'm the person whose needs aren't being met. Sometimes I need help with that. The thing which has most helped my work on disability generally, and particularly my legal cases, is solidarity. Solidarity reduces burden. It doesn't remove it, but it really helps. Usually, that help has come from other disabled people. We proofread each other's letters and chat about what good or bad approaches are. We turn up for each other in court and watch what happens. There's a lot to be said for not being alone. I love supporting other people in this way. It turns something which must be an individual action of taking a legal case into an action with wider purpose and impact. And I always learn things. I think my favourite thing that the court can do is a declaration. It's literally just a statement from a judge on official paper that something happened, that was a failure to make reasonable adjustment, and that was discrimination. It's powerful because it's so validating. In order for it to happen, I have to explain to a judge who's likely to have no experience with that particular type of discrimination why it was a failure to make a reasonable adjustment and how it caused an injury to my feelings. Without other disabled people, I would never have succeeded in doing this. It's hard to explain these things. And then, when the judge explains in their reasons why something was so harmful, other people can use that reasoning to help their own cases. When I make a complaint, whether it's a legal complaint or not, there are ways of responding which can add to the burden or reduce it. Sarah Ahmed is one of my favourite writers on the importance of complaint and how she says this: to be heard as complaining is not to be heard. To hear someone as complaining is an effective way of dismissing someone. You do not have to listen to the content of what she is saying if she is just complaining or always complaining. Sarah Ahmed is absolutely right, but it's always a delight and a surprise when an organisation is enthusiastic to hear what's not working and takes action on that. It does sometimes happen. It doesn't always mean doing what I asked, but it often does mean that. The flavour of a response which really engages with the need, doesn't dismiss it or minimise it, feels wonderful and makes me want to offer my ideas and help. It enables me to bring my whole self. Friends, I don't know where to end. In this moment, I've created for myself a wonderful life, filled with loving connection, spiritual leadings, meaningful work, and learning. Many, many things bring me joy. They include electric curtain openers, tiny spoons, my aging dog, beautiful flowers, and soy chai latte with buttery soft silicone straws. And my life is also shaped by the burdens of a hostile state and by physical and social environments which often don't meet my needs. I am not able to change much of society, even if I might want to. The structures available for me to make some dents in the problem are very limited. I can share my truth, and I can keep working on getting and keeping the support that I need to live my life, and I can help others to do the same. I can notice which options don't achieve anything and not waste my time on them. I can use the imperfect tools that are available to make what change I can. I can support others to do the same, which makes them more effective. I can do these things every day because it's what love requires of me. You doing the same will almost certainly mean different things to what it does for me. What do we need to ensure that we are able to flex our creative, loving imagination muscles, both towards ourselves and towards those around us? How can we, as the Simpler Meetings Project has so beautifully put, reduce the burden and release the joy?